In the last episode, we looked at how we could mock HTTP requests to test a React component that talks to an API. In this episode, we'll look at a slightly different approach where the HTTP logic has been abstracted into an API module that we then call from the user component. So now in the user component, I'm importing this fetch user function from the API module, and I'm calling it down here. That's the only change to the user component. The user tests are also exactly the same as we left them previously, and as you can see on the right, they're all passing. You'll also see we have this new file, api.test.js, and let's go and have a look at the API module and the test we've written so far. So api.js is just the two functions that we saw in the previous episode pulled out of the React component and into a standalone file. So we have URL for user, which isn't exported, and then fetch user, which is. So it takes an ID, it figures out the URL, and it then makes a request passing the data as JSON. When you pull out API calls like this into the standalone module, what's really nice is you can write tests for them that mock the HTTP requests without having to involve a React component. So now I've pulled this fetch user function out into the API module, we should write a test that checks that it can make the right requests and return the right data. So what I've done here in this test file is set up a skeleton for the test that we're about to write. So I've got my dummy user from before, and I've got the fetch user tests in a describe block with an it fetches the user. This is going to be an asynchronous test. I've also put in the URL that we'll want to make the request to. So the first thing we want to do is mock a GET request to that URL. So I'm going to say fetch mock.get, and again I'm going to use get once. I'm going to mock that URL. I'm going to want to return with a status of 200, and the body is dummy user. Fetch mock does provide a bit of a syntactic shortcut here. If you're only mocking a successful response and you're passing in an object to be the JSON response, you can actually just call get once with a URL and then the actual body that you want returned. I find if I'm testing a bunch of different scenarios, like a error case where maybe the API 400s or 500s and then a success case as well, I like each test to be very clear about what the status code is that it's mocking. But in our case, because we're only doing once and the test description is it fetches the user, I think it's fairly obvious that the get mock request is going to be the success case. So therefore, I'm quite happy to use this shorter syntax for mocking the URL. So now what I want to do is grab the response of calling fetch user, passing in 1 as the ID. So I can say const response, and I'm going to await the result of calling fetch user with the ID of 1. And now I can say I expect response to equal dummy user. So this is just saying that when I call fetch user, it should make that request to the right URL and return me the data. And you can see that test is still passing. Let's check that it's passing by just saying we expect the response to be an empty object. And you can see there that it fails because we're passing in an ID, a name, and a website. This is a fairly common pattern in test. You'll have a response, which is a result of awaiting something asynchronous, and then you'll expect the response to equal the dummy user. For situations like this, there is actually a shorter way you can write this. We're going to await, and then we're going to make a asynchronous assertion. So we'll expect fetch user 1 dot resolves to equal dummy user. And you can see that passes. And again, if I change this to be an empty object, you'll see that the test fails correctly. So if you'd rather have it over 2 lines where you explicitly have the response, and then you expect that response to equal the dummy user, you can do. But if you're happy merging them into one, you can also have that line, and that does exactly the same thing. Just saves you a bit of space. Some people might find this a bit less clear, and that's absolutely fine. It's more personal preference if you like that syntax more or less than the other way of doing it. Now we've taken the time to fully test our API module and mock that using fetch mock. Let's go and see how we might be able to tidy up the React user component tests. So here are the tests we had for the user component. They're exactly the same as we left it in the last episode. But now we're mocking and testing the API module via HTTP requests in the API test file. It feels overkill to do the same thing here. Instead, all we need to do in this module now is mock that the fetch user call returns some valid data. Mocking the full HTTP request is too much. This is a unit test for the user component. The user component happens to use a function from the API module, and we've unit tested that by mocking HTTP requests. So here, instead of mocking the full HTTP request, what we can do is just mock that the fetch user function returns what we want. And we can use Jest's built-in spies to do that for us. So let's see how we might swap out a test to use Jest spies rather than mocking a full HTTP request. The first thing I'm going to do is go up to the top of our tests and import our API. I'm going to use the import star as syntax, and I'm going to call it API, and you'll see why that is needed in a minute. I don't just want to import the function, I'm going to import the whole module. So let's go to our second test, the one that checks that we actually render the data that we get from the API. So rather than mocking the actual call, I'm going to delete that now. If I hit save, we're going to see an error, And this is fetch mock telling us that there's no response actually defined for a GET request to this URL. Instead, what I'm going to do is say jest.spyon. Jest.spyon takes two arguments. It takes an object, which in this case is our API module, and then the string, which is the function name to spy on. So I'll say fetch user. Now, Jest will track when fetch user is called, and it will also track what arguments it's called with. This is really useful because it lets you check that a component is calling out to another module with the right data. However, doing this by itself isn't enough because Jest will still call the original fetch user implementation. If you want to mock that, you have to call mock implementation and give it a function as its argument. And in here, we can return whatever data we want. And then when our component calls fetch user, it won't call the real fetch user function, it will call this fake implementation. In our case, fetch user in real life will make an HTTP request and return a promise with some data. So all we need to do here is skip out the HTTP request and just return a promise as if the result was a successful request. So we can say promise.resolve, which creates a promise that will immediately resolve, and the data is the dummy user. Now if I hit save, you can see that all our tests are green again. And just to prove that it's working correctly, let's change this dummy user to be a user with a name of Alice. And we should see that this test now fails. And there you go, you can see it expected the name to be Jack, but it got Alice. And we can tidy this up as well. Rather than having to have a return here, I can get rid of the braces and have the return inline, like so. And that's just a bit tidier. Let's go and update our test above with the same spy. Those tests are now all passing, and now we can entirely get rid of fetch mock from this test. And I'll get rid of the mock URL with user function as well, and we don't need the URL anymore. And you can see there that the tests are still passing. There's one more thing we need to do though. Look what happens if I comment out the mock for the it shows the data test. At this point you would expect it to fail. However, the test still passes successfully. The reason this is because Jest spies by default aren't reset between each test. So a spy defined in one test, like the one up here, will live on into any other tests. This isn't desirable behavior. Each test should be able to run complete from scratch and not depend on any other tests. Jest provides a function here called restore all mocks, and we can run that before every test. So let's say before each, jest.restore all mocks. What this does is it takes every single spy that we've defined and it clears them out between each test. This guarantees that no spy lasts outside of the one test it was defined in. If I save that now, you're going to see that we get an error. The test is failing correctly. If I go down here and I remove the comment around my spy, we're back to green. But now we know that none of the spies from one test are leaking into another. As before, I'd probably pull this Jest code out into a function. So we could say mock fetch user response, and it will take in the user, and then I'll copy this code here. And we just need to swap out dummy user there for user. Then we can swap this line out for mock fetch user response, passing in dummy user. Just say that and check we're still passing. And we can do the same thing in this test too. And those tests are now a little bit clearer.